Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Saturday, June 11th, 2022, and today we are going to be looking at a 2024 presidential election matchup between Vice President Kamala Harris and Governor Ron DeSantis from the state of Florida. Now, the reason why I'm doing this matchup is because when I made my Joe Biden versus Ron DeSantis prediction, I saw many people asking that there would be a prediction between Harris and Ron DeSantis, the reason being that for the 2024 presidential nomination, there is no guarantee that Joe Biden does run for re-election. While the White House outwardly has been saying very much that he is going to be running for re-election, and personally speaking, I think that we should count on it just because it is very non-traditional for incumbent presidents to not run. But then again, Joe Biden is the oldest president ever elected, so that will certainly be taken into consideration. I also think it just makes sense to explore opportunities and possibilities beyond a Biden re-election bid. Kamala Harris would be a shoo-in for the Democratic nomination, wouldn't really face much contention. I don't even think that anyone could defeat Kamala Harris should she run as the incumbent vice president for the presidential nomination. It will be a lot more easy to beat her if she is to be, let's say, 4 years removed from the presidency, 8 years removed from the presidency, such as Joe Biden was in the 2020 presidential election. But then again, we saw that recognition, that name recognition, that connection-based position that he was in, being vice president, helped him secure the nomination, and it very well might for Vice President Harris. As for Governor Ron DeSantis, the reason why he's our potential Democratic-Republican nominee is because we have been talking a lot about President Trump and not so much about possibilities of other candidates. Ron DeSantis is probably the only other person who I've talked about in at least a high amount in regards and comparison to President Trump. But beyond that, we really don't explore many other Republicans, even though there's a very real possibility that it is neither Trump or DeSantis for 2024. So I've decided that for the remainder of these videos, we are going to be talking about matchups that might not necessarily be the most mainstream or most expected, but definitely ones that are worth exploring and would be fun to take a look into. So I've taken too much of your time talking about this background. Let's go ahead and start characterizing all of the states that we know how they're going to go. These are safe states that we know are going to be decided by 15 points plus, with a near certainty will go to the incumbent party or the non-incumbent party that I characterized them with. For example, Washington, D.C. voted for Joe Biden by about 90 points. We know that's not going to the GOP. We know California is not going to the GOP. We know Oregon is not going to the GOP. Practically every state here, there is a very slim, meaning less than 1% chance that Ron DeSantis or any Republican really in 2024 is able to win these states, which is why we are so overly confident that there will be a safe blue characterization in all of these states and districts that I have characterized. Moving onward to the GOP, they of course have their own select safe states. In this matchup, I would say that Alaska would be safe. I would say Utah, Idaho, Montana, North and South Dakota, Wyoming. Let's keep continuing across the United States. Many, many safe states, not really that many competitive states, to be quite honest with you. There are some states here that might be narrowed down to a 14, 13-point margin. That is something that I really haven't taken much into consideration. Maybe South Carolina, Missouri, Indiana. That's a very, different type of possibility. Same thing for Democrats in maybe Connecticut or Washington or Oregon. But relatively inconsequential, nothing super important in those states. And honestly speaking, Harris is going to win in the blue states that I've characterized. Ron DeSantis would win in all of the red states that I've characterized, so I don't really feel uncomfortable with where I've characterized them right now. We all know how they're going to go. There is no real point in arguing down to a few percentages when it comes down to states that are going to be either 14 points or 16 points. It'll matter a lot more when it comes down to the closer states. So that puts Ron DeSantis at 125 electoral votes, the Democrats at 181 with Vice President Harris, meaning that 232 electoral votes are back in the toss-up column. And I say back because in nearly every election prediction that I've done for 2024, it is that magic number, 232 toss-up electoral votes. Obviously, every single one of these states cannot be competitive by margin and will be states that will likely be contested for the next few elections by both political parties. So let's go ahead and get started with the likely Democratic states. To start, we normally do likely Republican states, so let's go ahead and flip it up and work with the Democrats first. These are states that I believe will be decided between 5 to 15 percentage points. We generally know how they're going to go, but it's also not going to be entirely insane should there be a victory for the opposition party from how I characterize them. So It could be possible that, for instance, Democrats win a likely red state, but it is also highly unlikely, which is why we give Republicans that likely characterization. It also just isn't solid enough or safe enough of a state that we have a margin that is considered to be safe or solid. Anything that is less than 15 points means it's within the realm of possibility of being captured. We've seen some states that were decided by 5-6 points flip in the next election, such as Georgia went to Trump by 5-6 points in 2016, then went to Biden, right? So states like that deserve this characterization because we generally know how they're going to go, but it also wouldn't be a shocker should they flip in a future election or get closer in a future election. So to begin, the likely Democratic states, or rather should I say likely Democratic state or states actually, we have the state of Maine, which is likely for the Democratic Party. That will be accompanied by a likely Republican characterization in just a moment, and the state of Colorado. These are the two states I would say are likely blue states in this matchup. I think Ron DeSantis has a lot of benefit for the GOP, that he appeals to the Trump base while appealing to minority voters in a new way. I also think that specifically Ron DeSantis has performed well in Florida amongst Hispanic voters. Hispanic voters are not a monolith across the nation, but it's not just DeSantis. It is a nationwide trend in what we've seen across the country. Amongst Hispanic voters right now, Biden has about a 24% approval rating in one of the most recent polls that just got released. I wouldn't exactly say that is anything to celebrate, especially when Democrats typically win the Hispanic vote 60-40, 70-30, sometimes 80-20, depending on the region of the nation. And Democrats will be highly reliant on it if you have a candidate who has shown the political ability to win over minority voters in a way that many other Republicans haven't, in addition to an already fractured Democratic Party that has lost minority votes just due to the fact that there isn't a performance from the White House that minority voters are really attracted to. It makes it very difficult to win these voters. I do think Democrats under a Harris-DeSantis matchup would still win Hispanic voters nationwide. I just think it would be narrower than 2020, which would do a lot of damage in some states that otherwise were closer in the 2020 presidential election. So Colorado, Maine, two states I'm comfortable characterizing as likely Democratic states. For Republicans, on the other hand, they have a lot more likely states. So to begin, we have Iowa and Ohio, which really jump up DeSantis' numbers to 148. These are two states that practically overwhelmingly voted for Donald Trump twice. They voted for Trump in 2016 by 9 points in Iowa, 8 points in Ohio. 2020, they were both 8-point margin of victories for Donald Trump. The interesting thing about it is that these two states were Obama states twice. They were competitive. They went to Gore. Iowa went to Gore in 2000. Both of them went to Clinton in 1996 and 92. These states had been swing states. They had gone back and forth much more recently, especially due to President Trump, have no longer become these swing states, but rather pretty solid Republican states. So Iowa, Ohio, I think they would retain their likely red characterization under DeSantis, especially against an opponent like Harris. I think she individually loses voters relative to Biden across the Rust Belt, doesn't do as well in the inner cities. I think there is just overall an improvement for DeSantis against a candidate such as Vice President Harris. I think she might provide some level of electability in different parts of the country, such as the West Coast or in major cities, but I also think the drawback amongst rural America, suburban America, combined with a minority pushback also wouldn't be too beneficial. I think Harris might be individually talented in some aspects, but generally speaking, I think she would be a weaker candidate than Joe Biden, especially being a technical non-incumbent in this race. There's a reason why incumbent presidents typically win re-election. It's very hard to lose as an incumbent. This would practically become an open race across the country. So looking at it right now, 193 for Harris, 148 for Ron DeSantis, but he actually gets a huge bump from the state of Texas, which pretty much matches him to where Harris is right now. This is another likely red state, was likely red in 2020, likely red in 2016, safe red in 2012. There is a leftward trajectory, but I think Ron DeSantis could slightly walk it back. I think Texas is absolutely going to be a swing state for the next few decades, but I do think that as of 2024, in this matchup, DeSantis would win at around 7 to 8 points, and then it starts to get even closer. I think Trump was just such a bad candidate for Texas, especially in 2020, and that Biden was somehow a strong one. He won the Democratic primary there. He also, while saw drawbacks in regions across the southern border, saw boosts in the suburban areas, saw boosts in the urban areas, and that was able to benefit Joe Biden, enough so that the margin of victory for Trump in 2020 was 5.6%. I think DeSantis could improve on that, but then in the future, of course, it could become more competitive. As for the state of Florida, this is Ron DeSantis' home state. He is immensely popular, going to soar to re-election, and he will likely win it in 2024. We're not talking a 15-point margin of victory, otherwise it would have been characterized as safe, but you're talking about maybe nearing double digits or somewhere in the high single digits. Ron DeSantis is popular for a reason, and the home state appeal is definitely going to benefit him in a state where he's the governor from. While I do understand that a presidential election is a lot different, Florida also typically leans to the right of the nation, and generally speaking, I think there will be an improvement relative to 2020. So if Florida went to Trump by 3, it's not hard to imagine that DeSantis wins it more than 5, especially knowing his incumbency status and his level of popularity across the state. As for Maine's 2nd congressional district, I would characterize that as likely red. I think that, while Ron DeSantis will be winning in the Trump regions, I also think, across the 1st congressional district, there won't be as much of crossover appeal. I think there will still be a level of victory that leaves it as a likely red state. I don't think it'll be as good of a victory as Donald Trump's was in Maine's 2nd district, but it's enough to characterize it as likely red. So that brings Ron DeSantis to 219, Vice President Harris to 193, and let's go ahead and continue into the states that we can characterize as lean states for either political party. So again, we will start off with the Democratic Party for their lean blue states, and we have 2 of them. Can you guess which 2? It's the state of Virginia, which is 13 electoral votes. This is where we saw Glenn Youngkin, the Republican, win in 2021. I don't think Ron DeSantis will win Virginia. The pushback was on Terry McAuliffe and Joe Biden, but on a presidential level, these voters know what they want. Northern Virginia flipped because of education, and they won't do it for DeSantis. They won't do it for a Republican in 2024, and it's very clear to see that with their 2020 margin. There have been times where Republicans, for instance, in 2009, won in Virginia's gubernatorial race by 20 points. And they didn't have an incumbent. You can't run for re-election as a governor there. You have to wait a term. So when Bob McDonnell ended up winning across the state by 20 points, it was a super significant margin, and it was very, very impactful. So that was something that sent a message to the Obama administration that, hey, Virginia is still very much a state that can be won and has been won by Republicans, but then in 2012, he ended up winning it. So I don't exactly see this as a state where that one governor election automatically indicates that Ron DeSantis or any Republican would win in Virginia. I do think it would narrow down, though, which is why it's like lean blue and not likely blue. As for the state of New Mexico, I talked about this briefly previously, talked about the Hispanic shift and just the general loss of voters amongst the southern border, amongst Hispanic voters in the nation that are now upset with the Biden administration. While again, Hispanic voters are not a monolith, you do see national numbers. You do see statewide numbers, and New Mexico isn't looking too hot for the Biden-Harris administration. It's not looking too hot for Democrats either. I would say New Mexico right now can be characterized as a lean blue state. Still a victory, but not nearly as much as the 10 points that was won for Biden back in 2020. So that brings Harris to 211, and unfortunately for Harris, the lean blue states weren't even enough to match up to Ron DeSantis with likely red states and safe red states, which means we can move into the lean Republican states now, which will more than likely put Ron DeSantis over the finish line. I'm going to speed run it. Arizona, lean red. Wisconsin, lean red. Pennsylvania, lean red. North Carolina, lean red. And Georgia, lean red. And Nebraska's 2nd congressional district. So that already puts Ron DeSantis at 292. Ron DeSantis defeats Vice President Harris in this 2024 presidential matchup. Arizona, again, for a similar reason to New Mexico. Georgia, a walkback of traditional conservatives that were upset with Trump but willing to vote for a Republican. I keep it lean, though, not likely, and not to a return to 2016 margins or 2012 margins or 2008 proportions, but rather a lean margin because Atlanta is growing. There are more Democratic voters every single year than ever before, which means it will still be a difficult state to win. I just think there's enough of the suburban shift to move backwards that Georgia does end up going red. But it also means that there is still a possibility that Georgia does remain blue in another eventual matchup. North Carolina, very similar reason to Georgia, but it was also a red state in 2020. It's hard to see how it becomes a blue state in 2024 in a year where Democrats perform worse. Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, very narrow margins back in 2020. Biden won Wisconsin by 0.6, Pennsylvania by 1.2. While I don't think DeSantis will perform to the best of his ability relative to Trump in the Rust Belt, I think the nationwide pushback on Biden, the nationwide pushback on Harris is enough to see how Ron DeSantis does end up defeating them in these states that were otherwise exceptionally close back in the 2020 election. Harris is disapproved of, Biden is disapproved of. I can't imagine that these two states become a lot easier for the Democratic Party for 2024. So Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, lean red states. Nebraska's 2nd District, a walkback similar to what we saw for Romney and Trump. I think a Trump margin of victory can be expected in Nebraska's 2nd. So that leaves us at 35 toss-up electoral votes. Also, the 2nd District is more conservative now following congressional redistricting. So 35 toss-up electoral votes. Now we get down to the tilt states. So we know that the election has been declared for Ron DeSantis in this matchup, but a tilt state is one that is decided by less than 1%, or at least expected to be. And it means that it's going to be very narrow, to say the least. Looking at the tilt states that we have, or the states remaining, they could go either way. But as we see, it wouldn't really impact the outcome of the election too heavily. It might narrow it up for Vice President Harris, but it could also expand the margin of victory for Ron DeSantis compared to where he was in his matchup against Joe Biden. Right now, we're where we were in the Biden-DeSantis matchup, and now we're going to start expanding. So, to start from where we were before, we will characterize the tilt blue states, which actually ends up being a tilt blue state. Minnesota, I think, would be decided by less than 1 point, but Michigan, New Hampshire, and Nevada are all states I would say I expect the GOP to win. I don't think these margins would be substantial. I don't think they would be that large, but I do think there would be narrow victories for Governor Ron DeSantis in Michigan, New Hampshire, and Nevada. That would give him nearly a 100 electoral vote victory over Vice President Harris. So, in this matchup, there is a flip for DeSantis of Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and New Hampshire, and Nebraska's 2nd District, which is 8 states, 1 district. As for the Democrats, they have no flips. They hold on to, however, the swing states of Virginia, Colorado, Minnesota, New Mexico, and Maine. Beyond that, there's nothing more for the Democratic Party. So in this final map, what we find is that DeSantis would be a strong nominee for the GOP, and that Harris wouldn't be the strongest for the Democrats. Obviously, things can change. Harris's approval rating can also change. But generally speaking, she's been disapproved of longer than Biden has, and she doesn't exactly find herself in a position of immense power or immense victory in head-to-head matchups now, head-to-head matchups a year ago, or really in any circumstance against Governor Ron DeSantis, who has proven to be an electable and tried and tested Republican in Florida, and I think that could translate to an electoral victory across the nation. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.